Check, check. Check, check. Okay. Right. Good morning, everyone. This is the DRRM leg of the Bayanihan sa UP Diliman of the NSTP program. And I will be your host, Julius Rowan Lustro. I am an assistant professor and currently the College of Engineering NSTP coordinator. So I welcome everyone from a very long weekend, and hopefully everyone has rested and recovered. So for today, we'll be having two talks related to DRRM or disaster risk reduction and management. So first, I'm going to introduce our two speakers. On my left is an associate professor from the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and he's currently the director of the Environmental Engineering program of the College of Engineering. Um, I'm pleased to present to you Joseph Gerald Reyes, or he's fondly called G. Reyes from the College of Engineering. Right. And on the left of G is currently an assistant professor in the Institution of Civil Engineering, also in the College of Engineering. His research is in structural engineering and wind engineering. So please welcome Engineer Joshua C. Agar. Okay, without further ado, I'll pass the mic to G. Reyes for his presentation.
Thank you, Doc Julius. Good morning sa lahat. Wala. Tapos na yung bakasyon. Balik tayo sa work. Good morning sa lahat. Okay. Sinong Lasal graduate dito? Okay. Naano kasing game kahapon. Anyway. So, thank you very much for this opportunity to present yung topic ko, which is disaster risk reduction and management. I also teach this course, by the way, sa isang sa isang N by Eng subject namin sa masters. Pero huwag kayong mag-alala, hindi to masters level ang presentations. Really more parang overview. Right? So, before anything else, kailangan may mga tanong akong kailangan ibigay sa inyo. Alright? Kasi sinasabi disaster. Ano ba ibig sabihin ng disaster? Yes, yung pagkatalo ng UP kagabi, disaster yon. Alright? Because, bakit? Natalo tayo. But anyway, a point dun. If we talk about disaster, What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Anyone? Sige nga. Interactive ako eh. When I discuss, I always like to make sure that my students, my audience is also in the loop, no? Ano ibig sabihin ng what do we mean? In your own words, just not look for a dictionary definition. In your own words, sa sariling interpretation nyo, ano ibig sabihin ng disaster? Maybe let's start with you, miss, the one in the red dress. Devastation. Devastation. Okay, alam mo na yung devastation. Di ba? Doon yung mga bus, di ba? Devastation. All right. Anyway, okay. Devastation. So the term sounds very nakakatakot, di ba? May panganib. Oh, by the way, okay lang if I talk in Taglish, no? I'm more comfortable being very casual with you. So devastation, yeah. All right. Well, another question. Wait, sige, let's go to the next slide. I have some questions na itatanungin ko sa inyo eh. First of all, what is a disaster risk? All right? So, pag sinasabing devastation, ano ba yung panganib ng isang disaster? At pangalawa, may certain arguments with regard to how disasters are defined. At isa dito sinasabi, natural disasters daw. But the question is, are all disasters natural? Tapos, follow that with, what is a hazard? What is a hazard? What is vulnerability? So how do we differentiate between the two, hazard and vulnerability and exposure? Yan po. So yan, no? So these are some terms that we will be coming across when we discuss DRRM. And the last guide question is, how can a disaster risk or how can disaster risks be addressed? So ibig sabihin, is there a way of avoiding them or recovering from them? So next slide tayo. So ito, definition ng UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction or the UNDRR, itong disaster risk. And what do we see here? Let me quote. It is the potential, notice ang potential naka-underline. The potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets which could occur to a system, to a society, or a community in a specific period of time. So it's not always all the time, specific period of time. Determined probabilistically as a function of, take note, hazard, exposure, and capacity. Mga engineering tayo, mahilig tayo sa functions. So we can see here that disaster risk has factors. Hazard, exposure, and capacity. Ngayon, naka-underline si potential. Ibig sabihin, bakit naka-underline si potential? Hindi pa nangyayari. But it can happen. A risk is something, okay, a risk is what we can say a consequence of uncertainty. Ibig sabihin, uncertainty, hindi pa alam eh. We can look at risk. Okay, maybe my analogy for risk is imagine yourselves in a dark room. Walang ilaw, madilim. Madilim. You're in the middle of that room, no light. Ano yung mga risks that you are facing while inside that room? Sige nga, ano yung mga risks nyo? Okay, bawal yung multo, walang naniniwala sa multo. The actual risks, the actual things that can happen to you if you are inside that dark room. Anyone? Sige, imagine nyo, I'm sure you've come across such a situation. When you're in a dark room, huwag kayong mahiya. Pwede mag-volunteer. Anong pwede mangyari? Okay, tawag tayo mukhang lasalista dito. At ikaw, sir, na may, may ID bracelet, kulay kaki yung suot. What risk are you facing if you're inside, standing alone inside in the middle of a dark room? Anong pwede mangyari sa iyo? You can trip. Di ba? Oh, pwede naman yun. Pwedeng matisod. Ano pa pwede mangyari? Anyone? Sige, si UP Maroons, yan. Yung, not you, the guy there. Oh, pwedeng madapa, pwedeng matrip. Tisod, ano pang pwede? Mag-isa nga eh, sabi alone, okay? Ikaw naman, naghahanap ka ng companion. No? You're alone, that's the case. So, pwedeng matisod, ano pang pwede mangyari? Pwedeng nahulugan ng debris. Wow, anong klaseng kwarto yan? Sira-sira na. But yeah, pwedeng notice, pwede. You're all guessing. Why? Because it is dark. Dark inside. So there's the risk of getting hurt physically. Diba? So you have two choices. What to do to address that risk of being inside a dark room. One of the choices is you do not move. You do not move. You just stay in place. Pero, does that solve the problem? Yeah, you will not get physically hurt. But if the time comes that you have to leave the room, wala kayong magagawa kasi stuck kayo sa room. What's the other choice? What's the other choice? You switch on the lights. In other words, when you switch on the lights, nakikita nyo na yung what is surrounding you inside that room. In other words, you go from a high level of uncertainty in the dark room and go into a high level of certainty. In other words, na-identify nyo na yung mga risks. That is why, sinasabi, potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets because the risk is not yet identified. It can happen. It can happen. So, tingnan nyo. All right. This is what happens. Next slide tayo. Tingnan nyo yung ating chart dito. This is from one of the websites dito. What do you see here? Excuse me. At pamagat ng screen cap ko dito, global deaths from disasters over more than a century. All disasters, what do we see here? Siyempre, pabari-bari yan. Over the century, we're talking of actually the 20th century going into the 21st century. Tama ba? Tama. 1900 to 2020. So, ito dito yung pinaka malaking disaster risk. Ano yung nakita nyo? Yung pinakamalaking disaster, okay, those that have affected a high population, droughts brought about by dry weather. Okay, why is a drought okay? Why can a drought lead to a big disaster? Because we are dependent on farming. We have farming. Dati wala namang ganon. Okay. Next is floods. So opposite ni drought, walang tubig, naging maraming tubig. Yan po. Now notice that earthquakes, ha? Kahit ba nakapat-devastating yung news about earthquakes, the number of people affected are much less than droughts and floods. Ano pa ibang disasters diyan? Volcanic activity, halos wala. Extreme temperature, storms. Nakita niyo yung storms. Isa pang nakakalungkot na mga balita yung mga storms na yan. But again, the number of people affected is very much less than the first two. And so on and so forth. Okay. Pero maybe we're not just talking about numbers here, but if you notice, every year, meron apektado. May apektado palagi. Which means to say that these are events, these are occurrences that cannot be avoided, that they take place time and again, and that there are people affected. Yan po. So, the disaster risks are always there. Even with our continually developing world, kahit ang dami natin technologies, one thing is certain, these cannot be avoided. Isa pa napapansin nyo, itong mga occurrences na to, they are all natural. Ibig sabihin, in nature nang gagaling yan. Those are not man-made events. No, droughts, floods, earthquakes, so on and so forth. Next slide tayo. Okay. Before anything else, kasi nga, ni-define natin yung DRR and what are the factors. So, Kanina may questions ako dun sa slides ko, no? So, what is a hazard? What do you see here? Let me quote, and this again is from the UN DRR definition. May glossary sila of terms. So what is a hazard? It is a process, a phenomenon, or human activity that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. Okay? Furthermore, they can be single, sequential, or combined base sa kanilang origin and effects, and that each hazard is characterized, take note, is characterized by its location, intensity or magnitude, frequency, and probability. So the risks of hazard are always present. Yan po. Kung tawag dito. So, andyan yung risk, and notice that what will be affected here are in particular, okay, everything about people, health, social, economic disruption, so on and so forth. Next, the next other term is exposure. What is exposure? Again, the situation of people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard-prone areas. So like in a dark room, you are exposed to the hazards of tripping, of things falling on you, etc. Andyan na yung hazards. Exposure is how exposed are you? Gaano ka open kayo? Gaano ka tawag dito? Unshielded kayo from those hazards. Next slide tayo. Vulnerability is another term. Vulnerability is defined as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impacts of hazards. I'd like to quote that para lang hindi ako ma-misquote. I'd like rather give that definition stated by the UNDRR. No? So vulnerability, gaano ka prepared o gaano kalakas tayo in facing those hazards. Pwedeng exposed tayo. Okay? Pwedeng high exposure. Pero pag high vulnerability, gaano kalakas ang impacts ng mga hazards yun should they happen. Okay? So vulnerability is multidimensional, and next to the other dimensions mentioned beforehand, they can also include cultural and institutional factors. So, ibig sabihin, we are not naturally, or we are not, outright vulnerable. It really is a situation-dependent matter. No? So, examples ng vulnerability, yan po. Okay, na nakikita nyo dito. And this is important especially for us, tayong mga nasa engineering. May mga walang engineering dito, no? Meron hindi from engineering here. But so it's not just a technical problem. It's also a social problem. Itong vulnerability. Ano nakikita nyo? Examples. Poor design and construction of buildings, inadequate protection of assets, lack of public information and awareness, high levels of poverty and education, so on and so forth. Diba? Weak governance. Yan po. Time and again, we read about disasters happening, okay, in areas na okay, disasters hindi na mimili ng mayaman o mahirap yan eh. Case in point, let's go back 2009, Ondoy. Who remember, okay, who knows what ano yung naging issue about Typhoon Ondoy? Buhay na ba kayo noon na nagka-Ondoy? 2009. Okay, Ondoy was a particularly tragic event because hindi siya typhoon in the sense na malakas ang mga hangin, etc. Pero ang lakas ng rainfall. It registered one of the highest rainfall in Metro Manila. At nangyari dyan is that the dams were were already beyond critical level. Ibig sabihin, kapag pinabayaan pa yan, the dams will start to break. So anong nangyari? Because umaabot ng critical level, water had to be released. By the way, Ondo is just one example. We've had recent cases na nag-release ng tubig yung dam kasi nag-overfill nila because of excessive rain. Kapag magre-release ng tubig sa dam, dapat, number one, nakaprogram yon. Hindi yung parang sudden decision lang. Okay? Ibig sabihin, kapag abot ng critical level, may time na magre-release and at a certain rate na there will be, yes, some inconveniences pero hindi ganun kakatastrophic. Ano nangyari? When the dams released, okay, we're talking about La Mesa Dam, when they released yung tubig nila, it was released at such a high rate of flow such that nag-overfill ang Marikina River and all the tributaries, and a lot of places in Metro Manila were submerged. Okay? That thing could have been avoided. Yan po. Now, vulnerability, okay? Yun nga, isa nag-contribute yan. Bakit nagkaroon ng ganun bad decision? And I think earlier this year or was it last year, sa Cagayan Valley nangyari din yan. Nag-release ng tubig sa dam because nag-overfill na. As a result, nagkaroon ng baha na hindi inaasahan. And of course, maraming apektado. Sige, next slide tayo. All right, given that we have all of these disaster risks taking place, it was determined by the UN to have what is called DRR or Disaster Risk Reduction. Ibig sabihin nga yan, they now want to switch on the light in that dark room. So, disaster risk reduction is targeted at preventing any new and reducing existing disaster risks. So they have accepted that the disaster risks are there. And now they want to address paano ma-reduce yan. Yung nga sinasabi ko, switch on the light in the dark room. All right? And all of which contribute to strengthening resilience and therefore to the achievement of sustainable development. So when there is a disaster risk, paano ma-reduce yung impact niyan? Whether it has taken place, in other words, mitigation or rejuvenation or recovery, yan po, no? Or for future prevention. Tapos we have DRM or disaster risk management, which is targeting disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. So this is meant for prevention of new disaster risks, reducing existing disaster risks, and managing residual risks while contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of losses. Okay, so DRM actions can be categorized into the following: prospective disaster risk management, corrective disaster risk management, and compensatory disaster risk management. Yan po. So, prevention, mitigation, and recovery. Yan po, no? Sinong taga-Provident Village dito sa Marikina? Wala. I guess lumipat na kayo. A very high-class subdivision that was submerged underwater during Typhoon Ondoy. Na for several nights, the residents were on the roofs of their houses waiting for help. Walang kuryente. Ang kwento ng mga kilala kong taga roon, nung time na nangyari yon, sa gabi, kasi madilim, walang ilaw, they could all hear cries for help. Yan po. Why was Provident Village built there? We don't know. Built near the banks of the Marikina River. It looks safe, maybe, but because of what we will say are developments, pinagbibintangan nila yung isang mall dyan sa Marikina. When it was built, dyan daw lumala yung mga floods, yun sabi nila. Of course, that remains to be seen. Okay? Anyway, next slide. All right. Konting history lang about DRM. So, in 2005, meron tinatawag na Hyogo Framework for Action. So 168 governments in January 2005 adopted what is called a 10-year plan to make the world safer from natural hazards during a conference in Japan, in Hyogo, Japan. Ngayon, yung number one na disaster risk na tinitnan nila that time, during this time, was drought. Because maraming occurrences ng El Nino, nagkakaroon ng dry weather, nagkakaroon ng severe lack of rainfall. All right? So, the Hyogo Framework provided a global blueprint for DRR. Tapos nga, hinahabol, in 10 years, dapat na-reduce niya o ma-address na yan. So the goal is to substantially reduce disaster losses pagdating ng 2015. When it's 2015, 8 years ago. So dumating na ang 2015, anong nangyari? Next slide. Sa 2015, upon review ng Hyogo framework, nagkaroon na ngayon ng Sendai framework. Sa Japan pa rin. Mahilig sila sa Japan. Hindi ko lang bakit. Baka anime. Anyway, Sendai Framework 2015. Why did they come up with this? Ano ibig sabihin nun? Kailangan pa na improvements. Ibig sabihin, hindi na-attain yung goals ng Hyogo Framework. So they now came up with the Sendai Framework, which is a 15-year plan. We are halfway into that 15-year plan, which has been 8 years since the Sendai Framework was established. And the Sendai Framework is also, okay, so the target nila is again disaster risk reduction. So may lessons sila from the Hyogo framework, and now have come out with the Sendai framework. And this was also tied in with the UN SDGs. So the UN came out with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them, 3 of which are covered by this Sendai framework. So ano yung from this Sendai framework, nagkaroon na tinatawag natin 7 targets as well as 4 priorities for action. Ano yung mga 7 targets na yan? Pakitingin natin sa next slide natin. So, tingin natin dito. No? So, what are the 7 targets? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Low. Excuse me. So, ano nakita nyo sa isang triangle dito? Substantially reduce what? 1, global disaster mortality. So they want to reduce the number of deaths or injuries globally. Pangalawa, they want to reduce the number of affected people or people who will be affected by these natural disasters. Pangatlo, they want to address economic loss due to, in relation to the gross domestic product of the average GDP ng entire world, no? And damage to critical infrastructure and service disruption. So yan po, substantially reduce. Okay? Tapos, at the same time, they also want to substantially increase the number of countries with national and local DRR strategies pagdating ng 2020. It's been 3 years. Ano bang state natin ngayon? Well, I'm not going to discuss that. That will be discussed later on by our other speaker. Tapos, international cooperation to developing countries. So take note, the Sendai framework is meant for the developed countries to aid the developing countries. Parang yung developing countries yung walang capability pa or mababa ang capability compared to these developed countries. And lastly, availability and access to early warning systems and DRR information. Kung balikan natin yung slide kanina, over the century, during the century, ang daming disasters nangyari. Now, we ask, it's about time na kailangan gumalaw na talaga. Kaya nagkaroon itong Sendai framework. Okay. So, let's look at the 4 priorities. So, kanina yung 7 goals. Ngayon, let's look at the 4 priorities. Next slide. So, ano yung 4 priorities na yan? What's the first priority? Ano nakasulat? Anyone? Everyone? Can you read? What's priority number 1? Understanding disaster risk. Balikan natin si dark room, buksan ng ilaw. Yan po. So DRR or DRM needs to be based on having a clear understanding of what is a disaster risk in all its dimensions in terms of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of persons and assets, hazard characteristics, and the environment. So kung baga, okay, at least for everyone, tayo nagkukumukuha ng math, we can see that disaster risk can be a function of three components: hazard, exposure, vulnerability. Yan po. So, kung mataas lahat ng factors na yan, the disaster risk is of course very high. How do we bring that down? The hazards cannot be avoided, so sabihin natin constant yun. So, the way to address that is by reducing vulnerability and exposure. Yung recovery means to say we increase the capacity. Second priority, ano siya? Strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. So ibig sabihin, it is already something that must be addressed by those who are not in power, but those who have control, those who have the responsibility of managing the country, which is the governments. And not just the governments ang nakasulat dito. Okay, national, regional, and global level. So across countries, dapat magtutulungan sila. All right. So yan po. So that's the second priority. Third priority, next slide. Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. When we see the word investment, it can be interpreted in two ways. One is it's going to be costly. Ang dami nagsasabi, ay mahal yan, etc. What is, let's say, billions of dollars compared to, let's say, saving millions of lives? You can, okay, money can be recovered, but lives cannot. Yan po. So that's where the term investment comes in. Like I said, it can be treated in one of two ways. And what is the fourth priority? Enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and may quote sila, excuse me, build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Ibig sabihin, pag mangyari isang disaster, has taken place, paano magre-recover? Alright? So that when such a disaster again takes place, the losses can be reduced. So yan yung 4 priorities ng ating Sendai frameworks. Ano ba yung guiding principles ng Sendai framework? Next slide. O yan. Ano nakita yung guiding principles? Ano yung first guiding principle? It is the states that have the primary responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risk. So, kailangan yung mga gobyerno they must take the lead in addressing or in implementing DRR. Second, there is a shared responsibility between the central government and national authorities. So, ibig sabihin yan, from the national government, it can be trickled down into the local governments. Pangatlo, protection of persons and their assets while promoting and protecting all human rights. So, how can they implement DRR at the same time, not have something na parang strong-armed rule? Okay, next is engagement from all society. So, ibig sabihin yan, partnership, it's not just the government's role, but everybody's role. How will each one, from the individual citizens all the way up to the government, how can they all contribute to attaining DRR? Next, full engagement of all state institutions of an executive and legislative nature at national and local levels. So, doon dapat lumalabas yung mga batas that will address DRR. Instead of being reactive, instead of waiting for a disaster to happen and then saka lang mag-a-action, anong action pwedeng gawin? Anong laws pwedeng ipasa to ensure that such disasters will have lower impact. Notice we cannot avoid disasters, but we can at least minimize or reduce them. Empowerment of local authorities and communities through resources, incentives, and decision-making responsibilities whenever it is appropriate. Yan po, no? And decision-making to be inclusive. Ibig sabihin yan, by consultation yan. There should be a committee consisting not just of government agencies, but actually also involving, say, private organizations. Ayan po, no? So yan yung mga guiding principles ni Sendai framework. All right. Now, looking at what you see here, okay, isipin nyo, okay, na-apply ba yan dito sa Pilipinas? Like I said, you'll be seeing the real picture later on. Ito pa ibang guiding principles. Next slide. Coherence of disaster risk reduction and sustainable development policies, plans, practices, and mechanisms. So kailangan everyone must understand everything about DRR. Accounting of local and specific characteristics of disaster risks when determining measures to reduce risk. Ibig sabihin yan, pag-aaralan, okay, saan ba, let's say in the Philippines, saan ba yung mga flood-prone areas? Kailan nagkakaroon ng floods doon? And furthermore, will these flood-prone areas remain as flood-prone areas forever? Minsan nagkakaroon ng mga bagong lugar na naging flood-prone. Why? Because of so many things that take place, changing the surface because of developments, whatever, infrastructure developments, etc. Addressing underlying risk factors cost effectively through investment versus relying primarily on post-disaster response and recovery. Yun nga, proactive stance. Saan ipapasok yung pera to ensure na sound siya. Now, this is medyo touchy issue kasi sinasabi cost-effective. Cost-effective and cheap are two different animals altogether when you put them side by side. Investment means to say may return, may mga balik. Cost is goodbye, wala na. Build back better for preventing the creation of and reducing existing disaster risk. Ibig sabihin, pag may nangyari na, anong gagawin para hindi na, kung mangyari ulit yung hazard na yon, hindi na magkakaroon ng malaking disaster. The quality of global partnership and international cooperation to be effective, meaningful, and strong. So more than just expecting nations kapag nagkaroon ng disaster, let's say in any country, to just give aid. Yung aid kasi is just mitigation lang just to help people na nagsasuffer. Ano yung future directions nila? Pagkabigay ng aid, tapos na? Hindi po. Dapat, meron dyan, yung nga, si Build Back Better. Tapos, support from developed countries and partners to developing countries to be tailored according to needs and priorities as identified by them. If you read the UN SDGs, actually tied up to with the UN SDGs. So, paano mag-a-achieve na itong mga developing countries yung kanilang disaster risk reduction? Supposedly, the developed countries already have that. Next slide. So, let me just introduce you to the office that is the, sabihin natin, the one in charge overall of the implementation ng Sendai framework. Yan. It is the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction or the UN DRR, and their primary goal or their primary function is to help decision makers across the globe better understand and act on risk. So they are advisory. Hindi sila police. Sila ay etong dapat yung gawin. Okay? So, anong nakasulat dito? Yung key message ng UNDRR. Ano nakasulat? It pays to invest in reducing the risks posed by disaster. So, sinasabi na dito, you have to spend. Just make sure you spend it wisely. Talagang investment yan. Alright? Yun po. Talking about Ondoy, ano yung naging isang investment na mga ilang barangay na na-identify na pwede pala sila magkaroon ng flood-prone area? They invested in boats. Ibig sabihin, mangyayari ulit yan. So we're here to just save. Was there build back better? We don't know. Okay. So, the UNDRR states that it's time to break the cycle of, ano nakita nyo dito? Disaster followed by response, followed by dependency, and then mauulit. So, the status quo, ito nga yung part na, it's time to switch on the light rather just stay inside the dark room na hindi kayo gagalaw and just wait for things to happen. Ayan po, ngayon. Now you see the analogy of my dark room thing. Yun. So, switching the focus from managing disasters to managing risks. Ibig sabihin, wag na hintayin, okay, disasters will be there, they'll be present. Pero how do we reduce the risks? Yan po. Tapos, eto, this is something, all right, dun sa isang tanong ko kanina, sa first slide ko, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Yan sabi nila. So it's not by chance that these disasters happen. There are natural hazards and they cannot be prevented. You cannot fight nature. So andun natural hazards, floods, droughts, earthquakes, etc., storms, etc. So it's a given, andyan sila. So they cannot stop those from happening, but they can work to lower or even prevent natural disaster. So you have to differentiate between hazard and disaster. Okay? Hazard, andyan na. Disaster is the result of a hazard taking place on a vulnerable and highly exposed community. Yan po. So, please take note now of the difference. So, yan po. In a nutshell, yan yung sinasabi ng DRR. No such thing as natural disaster, only natural hazards. So pag sinasabing natural, okay, pag sinasabing, why did they say hindi pwedeng no such thing as natural disaster? Because it's something that can be controlled. Yan po. Okay kaya so far, ano naging disaster na discussion natin? Ha? All right. So what are the primary objectives of DRR? So take note. We have two primary objectives. Reduce the following components of risk. What are those components? Vulnerability to disasters and exposure to disasters. Hindi pwedeng isa lang dyan. Dapat yung dalawang yan. Okay? And as I mentioned, risk is the consequence of uncertainty. By reducing the uncertainty, you also reduce the risk. Okay? So, DRM comes into the picture. DRM comes into the picture. What is DRM? Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yan, okay. Ano yung components ng DRM dito? So, DRM is aimed at risk reduction through the following. Number one, prevention. So, what is prevention? Activities and measures to avoid existing and new disaster risks. Again, hazards cannot be avoided, but disaster risks can be controlled. So prevention, hindi na dapat mangyari. Okay. If it's a flood-prone area, as an example, kung may flood-prone area at mangyari ang daming lupa, huwag naman gumawa ng subdivision dyan. Because you're bringing the people to a high exposure and vulnerability. All right? Next is mitigation. So what is mitigation? Nangyari na yung disaster, how do they address what is taking place when the disaster has struck? Yan po. So lessening or limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. So anong mga examples? Constructing flood defenses, planting trees to stabilize slopes, and implementing strict land use, and building construction codes. Part of what we call the build back better, hindi build. Build back better. Next, transfer. What is transfer? The process of formally or informally shifting the financial consequences or particular risk from one party to another. In other words, kung saan nangangailangan ng effort, ng tulong, dyan ipupunta. Dyan pupunta. Okay? And preparedness. The fourth factor, preparedness. which is the knowledge and capacities of governments, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of hazards. Ayan po. Now we know why we have earthquake drills. Now we know why may advisory sa atin, especially dun sa mga, well, sa atin lahat. Ano yung sinasabi nila? Kailangan may disaster pack tayong ready. Isang backpack na may mga canned goods, may mga water, flashlight, etc. That's part of the preparedness. Why? Because we cannot avoid hazards. And even kung, okay, and for whatever reason, okay, parang spare tire sa kotse yan. Hindi na lang kailangan kayo mafaflatan. But when it happens, you have to be able to change the tire. So even if we cannot just rely on, okay lang, the government is working on DRR. That doesn't mean you don't have to consider the backpack anymore that contains your emergency provisions. Yan po. All the way, of course, to the top. What can the government do to prepare? Anong ginagawa ngayon? May mga early warning systems tayo, may tracking ng bagyo. Dapat may bagyong tatama this week, pero nangyari, nag-lessen na. But yun nga, we should always be prepared. That's why they announce, okay, may bagyong tatama. So it's not just, walang klase, but rather prepare for the eventuality when it strikes. Saan mag-evacuate? Saan pupunta yung mga tao? Etc. Iba pa. Next slide. So here are some examples of DRM activities globally. So yun nga, identifying and measuring disaster risk, education and knowledge development, informing people about the risk, or what we call awareness training, which we're doing right now, and which I think is expected sa inyo to impart to other people. Incorporating DRM into their national planning investment, so it becomes part of the planning agenda of the national governments. Strengthening institutional legislative arrangements, providing financial protection for people and businesses at risk. Ibig sabihin, naka-budget dapat yan. And integrating DRR across multiple sectors that can be affected. Health, environment, infrastructure, so on and so forth. Next slide tayo. And there are 5 key areas in decision-making with regards to DRM. First is identifying the risks. Yan po, no? So, kailangan we should already learn from history what has taken place. We want to avoid yun nga yung cycle na disaster, saka lang magre-respond, tapos hintay lang mangyari yung disaster niya. So it's time to identify the risks. Again, we say that hazards cannot be avoided. So for example, if the hazard is, let's say, drought, what are the risks involved? What are the risks that are brought about by drought? Anyone? Pag drought, pag tutuyot, ano yung mga risks associated with drought? Yes. Loss of natural water. Pag wala tayong natural water, ano ibig sabihin nun? Okay, ano yung affected na sector? Primarily, the immediate sector that's immediately affected by drought is
agriculture.
Agriculture isa. Agriculture lang ba? Hindi lang agriculture. Pag drought, walang tubig, affected ang water levels ng dams natin. So hindi lang water, pati yung ating drinking water, ating water supply. So even the social sector is affected. Power sector. Bakit? Because some of our, talking about the Philippines, we have a lot of hydraulic power plants dito. Kung walang tubig, mababawasan kuryente natin, capacity ng kuryente natin. So actually, hindi lang agriculture affected yan. And if agriculture affected, anong ibig sabihin yan? Kung konti ang crops, bababa ang supply, tataas ang presyo, so on and so forth. So you can see the cascading effects. Yan po. So identifying the risks involved with hazards. Yan po. Very important. Second slide, risk reduction. Na-identify na yung risk, how do we address that? So for example, sa drought, kung magkaka-drought isang lugar, pabayaan lang ba, okay, it's known that a certain location has drought, anong pwedeng gawin? Pwede mag-establish na things like water storage, let's say. All right? Or distribute, let's say, crop, mga plantations to other areas that are less prone to drought. So things like that. Yan po, aaksyonan. Risk reduction. They cannot prevent drought, but they can prevent or they can lower or even prevent the risks brought about by drought. Next slide. Preparedness. So pag sinasabing preparedness, kailangan you have to have an understanding of the geographic areas affected along with the intensity and frequency of different hazard events. Okay? Yes. Nature yan or God's will yan. All right? But can we just let it happen just like that? Can you just let it take place? Can we just say malas? Hindi po. Kailangan paghandaan. Financial protection, next slide natin. So, it is a given that we need to spend in order to address itong mga disasters na to. Okay. Again, itong financial protection should be treated as an investment. Ibig sabihin may return yan. We cannot keep on, tawag dito, we cannot keep on cutting corners kasi mahal. Okay, maybe we can look at it this way. If let's say the part of the financial protection is investing in education, developing more technologies in order to help reduce this, and that's where we engineers come in. How can we contribute to that? How can we make the investments worthwhile? Next slide, resilient reconstruction. Ayan po. So, lalo na kapag may mga naapektan, there are already places that are affected by disasters. How can they build back better? Yan po, reconstruction. So yan yung 5 key areas of decision making sa DRM. So it is the job of whoever is in charge of disaster risk management on, prioritizing which areas should be covered, which areas should undergo reconstruction, or even relocation. Ang daming mga pwedeng gawin. It's all possible. It's all humanly doable. Yan po. No? Now, in the Philippines, we actually have a DRRM, next slide, as early as 2010. We have RA 10121 or the Philippine Disaster Reduction and Management Act of 2010. Katumbas, kasabay nito hindi ng Sendai framework kasi Sendai framework is 2015. But this was in 2010, so it was following the Hyogo framework. So in fact, aware na talaga ang Pilipinas noon pa about disaster risk. And they came out with this DRM. So it is a response to the Hyogo framework. So it is an act to reduce or to strengthening the Philippine disaster risk reduction and management system and is focused on implementing an efficient response to risk and disasters. So this is a 13-year-old act already. And what are the core values dito? Ito, nakasulat. Ito yung sa salient features niya. The core values to which it adheres to is good governance such as transparency and accountability within the context of environmental protection. Next slide. Ano yung mga features niya? So the features of this act are the following. Provide a comprehensive all-hazard, multi-sectoral, interagency, and community-based approach to disaster risk management. In other words, everyone should be involved. Hindi pwedeng dependent sa isang agency lang. Second, formulate the National Disaster Risk Management Framework. So even if it's just a certain area in the country that is affected, this framework will still take action. Next is provide a strong legal institutional basis for implementing DRRM in the country. So, sakop pati dito yung ating other branches of government, the legislative, especially the legislative branch. Next is provides basis for the development of policies and plans, implementation of actions and measures pertaining to all aspects of DRRM. So if you notice, disaster risk management should be a national priority, one of the national priorities. Okay? Include good governance, risk assessment, and early warning, knowledge building and awareness raising, reducing underlying risk factors, and preparedness for effective response and early recovery. So meron tayo ditong parang infographic ng DRRM. Next slide. Ito yung infographic natin. So yan po, scientific disaster risk, andyan yung mga factors, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. Yan po. The hazards as mentioned cannot be avoided. So kailangan ma-address is exposure and vulnerability. So nakita niyo yung mga actions dito. Well, yung hazards, they cannot control it, but at least they have something that should be in place, like early warning systems, okay, as well as mitigating hazards when they take place. Pero itong, okay, yung mga proactive dito, exposure and vulnerability and capacity, of which you see the different programs that are in our DRRM framework, brought about by RA 10121. Okay? So, I think pagka binabasa nyo ito, makikita nyo dito sa mga kulay blue na portions na yan, nothing is impossible. These are all doable. Kailangan lang talagang kumilos. Alright, so ano yung salient features pa ng RA 10121 natin? Next slide. So, number one, coherence with the international framework. Now, again, Hyogo framework pa to, but the Sendai framework, they just tied it in with the SDG. So, nothing has really, there's not a severe or a big change. Mangyari lang prioritize ng Sendai framework. Okay. Next, adherence to universal norms, principles, and standards of humanitarian assistance. Assistance will just go beyond aid, oras na nagkaroon ng kalamidad. Good governance through transparency and accountability, a strengthened institutional mechanism for DRRM, an integrated, coordinated, multi-sectoral, interagency, and community-based approach to DRR. Everyone must be a player. Next slide. Empowerment of our LGUs as well as civic society organizations as key partners. Okay? So, sila kasi yung parang may resources at may plans of action. Integration of DRRM into the educational system, of which we have this now. Ito sa NSTP. One of our tawag dito. One of the efforts of this one. Teaching you about DRRM. Ewan ko, may ibang courses ba ngayon sa college o sa UP that are focused on DRRM? Wala. DR maps. Okay. So, meron na. How about sa GE course? It's only a subject. GE course. Okay. No, may subject tayo ngayon. We have a formal subject for that. Tapos, magtatabi ngayon ng pera. So, there is a DRRM fund that should be accessible for all affected. Tapos, providing for provisions on the declaration of state of calamity, remedial measures, prohibited acts, and penalties. By the way, yung mga sinasabing prohibited acts, hindi lang po yan yung addressing yung problems brought about by hazards. Other prohibited acts, ano yung mga ibang prohibited acts? Hoarding. Nagtataas ng presyo. Okay? Tawag dito, coercion. Yun nga, violation of human rights. So, ang dami niya. Now, to give an idea, all right, one of the, yung parang sabihin natin pinaka-governing body ng sa Pilipinas with regard to implementing RA 10121, last slide ko, is the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, otherwise known as the NDRRMC. So, ang pinaka-head niyan is the Department of National Defense. And, okay, this is from the law, from the Republic Act mismo. And we could see here that together with the DND, we have the DILG, the DSWD, the DOST, and the NEDA as the supporting group. Tapos, under which you have the following agencies, the AFP, Department of Agriculture, so on and so forth, no? Hindi ko na isa-isayin yan. Tapos new members, this continues to build up. Hindi lang nasama dito yung mga private organizations and civil society organizations involved there. Well, CSO is civil society organizations. So may mga kumpanyang tumutulong na. So that in a nutshell, ano yung last slide ko. Ito yung mga references ko na pinagkuhanan ko with regard to defining DRR as well as, of course, discussing with the DRRM. Ngayon, yung details about what is taking place, I guess yung ating situationer will be taken care of by Prof. Josh over here. So that ends my discussion with you on overview about DRR and DRRM. Mamaya may open forum tayo, no? Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity.
Um, Thank you for your presentation, Dr. G. Reyes. Um, so we'll have a 5 minute of break before we continue our session. So if anyone wants to go to the toilet, you may do so. We have toilets on both the left side and right side of the Melcher Hall. Ayan. For people na nasa labas ng Eng Theater, so please come inside. Pakibilisan po sa attendance. Or pwedeng mamaya na po siguro yan. Or apat na lang naman. Pakibilisan na lang po. Okay, let's settle down. Okay. Buna po tayo. Okay, thank you. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our NSTP Diliman Director, Sir Dennis Kilala. Okay. So magpapatuloy po tayo ngayong umaga sa ating palatuntunan. So next program of presentation is on evaluating disaster risk and response by Engineer Joshua Agar. So I'm gonna give the mic to Sir Joshua.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Doc Jules. So, I won't be staying sa podium since medyo medyo kinesthetic tayo mag-present. So, again, lively na ba lahat? Nakapag-unat-unat na ba? So, good morning ulit. I'm Joshua from the UP Institute of Civil Engineering. Currently, I'm also the National Project Coordinator for the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, the one in charge of MDAT, which Doc G has presented earlier. While at the same time, I'm also involved in the development of vulnerability curves for the upcoming multi-hazard impact-based forecasting project by Pag-asa. So next slide, details on... Next slide po. Ay, hindi pa. Naglo-load pa yung screen. Sige. Okay, lalakasan ko yung boses. So, I'm involved sa research group namin, which is Structural Engineering Group. Ito yung main fields on which we are involved in. So, earthquake, typhoons, fire and blast engineering, structural health monitoring, and novel structural systems. But if you notice the first three bullets, so this pertains to yung hazards na na-mention ni Doc Chi earlier. Therefore, on the next slide, that's why we have disaster risk management as one of the 4 research interests under the structural engineering group. So whether may bagyo or whether there's an earthquake, typically we're the ones who are being sent to the site as part of the task force na who will be doing measurements or site analysis. So next slide. So we also have published parang conducted comprehensive research, particularly on evaluating yung disaster risk. So disaster risk, as mentioned by Doc G earlier, is a product of 3 factors, which is hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Since vulnerability is more has an affinity to building, so parang hand in hand yung relationship nila. That's why we were involved in the research in evaluating yung vulnerability, which is the 2014 GMMRAP report. And we followed that up in 2019 to 2021, next slide, with the projects where we get to collaborate with Pag-asa and PHIVOLCS in defining yung or enhancing yung severe wind vulnerability analysis, on which we identify different building types and eventually led to the evaluation of what's called yung severe wind risk map. So risk, again, next slide. Ay, wala pa ata to. So risk is basically for us civil engineers, quantifying how much infrastructural damage are to be expected every time na nagkakaroon ng natural hazard like typhoon. Or we are also counting the susceptibility of the population. So how many people will be affected if, for example, Typhoon Haiyan, which was shown right here, passed over northern Cebu province. We anticipated how many houses will be partially damaged, how many houses will be totally damaged, and how much yun nga, yung parang cost ng repairs na kakailanganin to have the area recovered after Typhoon Haiyan has passed. So next slide. So that's why we often refer to the situational reports by the NARMC. So this was the output that Doc G has been presenting to you about. So basically, these are the compilation of the definition ng hazard, the event itself, what led to the disaster, and what are the subsequent response. So our focus mainly, next slide, is getting what's called is compiling a database. So a local database on which for every barangay, pero hindi pa naman barangay level tayo, for every barangay kasi, they are counting how many houses are damaged, how many people are affected, how many agriculture crops have been perished during an event, so a disaster. And eventually, they were being passed over to the city level or the municipality level. So from DRMO, umakyat siya sa DRMO, then aakyat siya to PDRMC, then eventually mako-compile siya to NDRMC. And the reason why we are compiling these types of situational reports is not only to compile a national disaster database, next slide, but also to validate our upcoming impact-based forecasting. So what we are doing in the future is we are, for example, if there's an incoming typhoon or, for example, there's an anticipated earthquake, for example, sabihin natin, within the coming 20 years, there will be a magnitude na ganito na earthquake. So we are already modeling yung hazard na yun. While at the same time, using the NPSA data from the housing census data, we are also quantifying what's called yung exposure. So through the housing census. So all of the houses that were surveyed will be part of the exposure, which details how many buildings are present in the area affected and what type of building is it. Parang yun din yung isa sa question natin as engineers, because these buildings have different vulnerability, which we will eventually compile. So vulnerability is coupled with fragility. According nga sa Pag-asa, the vernacular daw for vulnerability is karupukan. So sino bang mga marupok sa atin ng mga past few days? Pero kailangan natin tibayan lang ng ating loob para resilient tayo, kasi naman daw yung yung spirit ng pagiging Filipino. Pero syempre, kailangan responsible pa rin and responsive yung response. Next slide. At the same time, we are also anticipating yung future na events, particularly on climate change. So the Climate Change Commission has been compiling what's called the National Adaptation Plan, and mahalaga din sa kanila na nako-compile or na-anticipate yung upcoming na risk. And we are also using the same components. So yung mga components na na-mention ko, next slide. Okay. So ito yung mga components na na-mention ko. So these are the components. These are what compose yung risk, what constitutes yung risk. So we have hazard. So pa shift ng slide. Yan. Hazard is basically yung probability ng event or yung magnitude ng event na nagko-constitute ng natural hazard. So magpo-focus lang muna tayo sa bagyo, since bagyo yung initial bagyo yung focus ng aking mga previous study. So, for example, meron ng bagyo, ano yung probability na darating siya or ano yung mga areas na tatamaan niya. Tapos, sa mga areas na tatamaan niya, that would constitute what's called exposure, which is yung next na ano. Next is basically ine-evaluate natin sa mga tinamaan ng lugar, ano distribution ng mga buildings dun sa lugar. Saan sila situated? Hello? Ayan. Then, at the end, for each building, syempre may na-quantify na kami na karupukan or vulnerability. Gaano ba sila ka-fragile kapag may dumating na ganito kalakas na hangin? Ano yung expected na damage mo? Which is yung vulnerability. So, next slide. So, hindi lang din basta-basta yung pag-evaluate ng hazard. So, parang sa hazard, meron tayong tinatawag na regional, meron din tayong tinatawag na local. Tapos sa exposure, may iba't ibang uri ng exposure. Iba-iba yung definitions natin ng exposure. And for vulnerability, we either rely on evaluating the fragility or evaluating the vulnerability. So these are two different yet parang similar na concepts which are to be discussed. Next slide. So if we mention yung regional scale, basically we're considering large scale na events or parang we're anticipating, for example, return period winds. So parang wala mo ng consideration ng locality. Pero pag kinonsider mo na yung locality, next slide. Ay, sorry, this is also another sample of a regional scale. So this is a sample simulation of the 10-minute sustained winds brought by Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. So yung na-identify natin ano yung mga tinamaan niya na area specifically and ano yung to the large scale na winds na tumama dun sa mga area. Pero we have to consider na 10-minute sustained winds to. So ibig sabihin parang yun yung hangin na yon is sustained over a period of 10 minutes to the very least. Maximum 10-minute sustained winds nga. Iba pang usapan, yung pabugso-bugso. Di ba kapag may dumadating na bagyo, bumubugso-bugso yung hangin, hindi naman siya dire-diretso. And minsan, mahina lang yung bugso, tapos minsan naman biglang lalakas yung bugso. So we have to consider yung local effects which are to be considered kapag nasa local scale, which is on the next slide. So sa local scale, we have this wind na parang larger scale, then it eventually cascades down from the regional level to the local level. So depende sa direction ng winds, depende sa effects ng location ng mga buildings, ano ba yung roughness ng ground, kung nagkakaroon ba ng topographic amplification. So iba-iba yung nararanasan na hangin ng bawat lugar. So may local scale pa ngayon na definition ng hazard. Next. We also have what's called yung sa exposure naman, parang iba yung meaning kasi niya pag we have that quantification of the buildings, but we also quantify yung effect, how does the surrounding affects yung localization ng hazard. So we have here Typhoon Riming back in 2006. Next slide, we have the island of Catanduanes experiencing two different wind speeds. So sa Virac Synoptic Station, which is situated on the western part of Catanduanes, 78 meters per second daw yung naranasan. So this translates to 278 kilometers per hour. Pero on the eastern part, we also have the Virac Radar Station and mas malakas yung hangin na naranasan niya, which is 89 meters per second, and this translates to 321 kilometers per hour, which is the record for the Philippines as of now. So magkaiba sila ng, parang kahit na pareho sila ng locality, parehong within Virac. It's mainly because si Virac Synoptic being situated on a flatland, while Virac Radar being situated on top of the mountain, there's what's called topographic amplification. So instead na parang as a result, tendency winds tend to get stronger when when topographic amplification happens. So next, We also consider what's called yung area-based exposure. So basically, this is the very definition of exposure. So we have here city of Cebu. Then we are quantifying how many buildings are there in that specific snippet of Cebu City. Then what types of buildings are they? But these are area-based. So for example, there's a hazard, a wind, ganito kalakas yung hangin. We are considering na throughout, parang for the whole Cebu City, the winds will be uniform. Pare-pareho na naranasan. But if we decide to increase the resolution of the exposure component, next slide, we will be, sorry. So this is another sample of area-based exposure. So again, municipality-based yung evaluation ng hazard, and municipality-based din tuloy yung evaluation ng exposure. But we also have to consider na depende din sa features, so yung feature-based exposure which is on the next slide, na possible na bawat building, iba-iba yung hangin na naranasan niya. Bawat lokasyon, bawat specific location within that municipality, depending on the surface features or depending on the topographic features of the site being analyzed, the hazards may vary, local exposure may vary, and at the same time, the local vulnerability may also vary. So in evaluating the feature-based exposure, we often rely on digital surface model. So parang LiDAR data siya. Then finifilter out namin para makuha yung mga buildings. Then sa bawat buildings na yun yung kinukuha namin yung key components. Then at the same time, in-evaluate din namin yung distribution ng local hazard. Next slide, we also have what's called building exposure. So this is a present on our codes. Medyo maarte din si building eh. Parang saang direction nang gagaling yung hangin? Kapag halimbawa ang front diretso lang, iba yung response ng building. Kapag galing dito, iba din yung response ng building. Kapag galing sa likod, iba din yung response ng building. We have to take account those. And eventually, this cascades down to the vulnerability component, which is on the next slide. So sa vulnerability, it's important to identify all of the vulnerable components within the structure. So pag building yung pag-usapan natin, we have to isolate the discussion on buildings before we move the discussion to other types of hazards. So parang buildings, and then severe winds. So these are the components typically these are the components identified to be typically vulnerable against severe wind. So we have roof sheets na palaging nililipad, we have windows na palaging nababasag, or minsan yung buong bubong natatanggal. Or for lightweight components, yung mga wooden na walls natatanggal din. So we have to identify gaano sila ka-vulnerable. And identifying how these are vulnerable will lead to, next slide, to what's called vulnerability curves. So we are relating yung magnitude ng hazard, which is on the x-axis right here, to the expected building damage. So how do we interpret this? For example, may dumating na gantong kalakas na hazard. Next slide. Then, based sa curves, we are already anticipating ano yung average na building damage. For example, 240 kilometers per hour. Tapos sabi ng curves, 71%. So, you would expect on average na sa gantong uri ng building, you would expect a 71% damage. On the other hand, we also have what's called fragility. So yung fragility, instead quantifying the building damage, we are identifying what's called damage state. Anong estado ng pagkasira? Is it lightly damaged or slightly damaged, which is damage state 1? Moderately damaged, which is damage state 2, severely damaged, which is damage state 3, or complete collapse, which is damage state 4. So each of them has its own probability of exceedance. And to utilize these types of curves, again, we propose a scenario, which is on the next slide. For example, dumating ang gantong kalakas na hangin. These winds have affected this area. And among the population of buildings with a certain building type, which has this fragility curve, you have here the blue one, damage state 1, damage state 2, damage state 3, damage state 4. Basically, what these curves will be providing you is how much of the population will have no damage, how much of the population will have damage state 1, how much of the population will have damage state 2, damage state 3, and damage state 4. So parang cumulative siya. So anything that's above the damage state 1 curve pertains to the building percent population that suffered no damage. Anything that's between the curves of damage state 1 and damage state 2 pertains to the buildings that suffered damage state 1. The population that's between the curves of damage state 3 and damage state 2 are the buildings subjected to damage state 2. And between damage state 4 curves and damage state 3 curves, you'll be given a population or percentage of the buildings that has experienced damage state 3. And the rest, you would anticipate na damage state 4. Since these are probability of exceedance. So we are parang na-exceed na ba yung scenario? Is it more probable? That's the question that the fragility curves have been answered. Next slide. So as to the disasters themselves, so, since we're magsasawa na tayo, puro tayo severe winds, puro tayo typhoons, we have to identify other two types of hazards. So I think hindi naman to na-mention ni Doc G. So according to MDAT, which was the database that Doc G has referred to when on the UNDR report that was shown in the previous presentation. So the disasters are being grouped into groups. Then we have types. Then we have subtypes. And for the disaster groups, there are two main classification of disaster groups. So we have natural, although again, we're very averse on telling na natural disasters, but for the sake of definitions, these are disasters caused by natural. So we have here climatological, biological, meteorological, industrial, miscellaneous, and transport accidents. So for the natural, it pertains to the first 5, but for the technological, it pertains to the last 3. And next slide, identifying each. So we have here biological hazards. So anything that involves living organisms. So kasama na rin virus doon kahit hindi siya counted as living organism. So we have animal incidents, we have epidemics, we have infectious disease, we have bacterial disease, we have parasitic diseases, viral diseases, prion diseases. So sorry, medyo there's a typographical error. Infestation, grasshopper infestation, locust infestation, or worm infestation. So for each type of hazard, so we then identifying hazard, for example, epidemic. What are the how do we then identifying exposure? So yung exposure will be the exposed population. And how do we then quantify the vulnerability? So the dose-response relationship. For example, us here in the engineering theater, we propose a local scenario. For example, one of us got sick. Hopefully not COVID. Pero ayun. So the existence of an infected pertains to the hazard. And how do we quantify hazard? How many people are infected? While at the same time, how much virus or pathogens are they emitting? Exposure pertains to the distribution. How many of us susceptible are here? What are the demographics of the susceptible population? What types of PPEs are we wearing? Then eventually on quantifying the vulnerability, depending on the dosage of the pathogens, ano yung magiging immune response mo. Kapag mataas yung dose, you would expect na mas mabilis yung onset ng disease. Parang hindi kakayanin ng immune system natin. And kalaunan, baka may umubo na lang, kinabukasan or so on. Pero knock on wood, wag sana mangyari dito yun. So that's how we quantify yung risk pertaining to biological hazards. Next, na-mention din to ni Doc G, yung droughts. Droughts are part of what's called climatological hazards. So climatological hazards, parang mahaba yung duration niya. Intraseasonal siya or ano siya, malaki yung scale na nako-cover niya. So it's main climate change, pwede natin sabihin na climatological hazard siya, pero ano yung mga specific na disasters na kinokos niya? Yun yung nililista natin dito. So we have here drought. Ano ba yung, paano natin ma-establish that the hazard is present? Either we record a historical low precipitation, ibig sabihin tuyo, hindi madalas inuulan, or there's an existence of water stress, meaning the demand is greater than the supply. Parang, ayun nga, nagkakalaban-laban na sa tubig. Exposure will, on quantifying yung exposure, ano yung magiging affected dun sa hazard? So yung agriculture natin, yung social infrastructure natin, syempre, ano rin, basic needs natin yung water. Even yung industry, how does water fuels these industries? Eventually, on quantifying the vulnerability, we quantify the relationship of the local hazard. So depending on the water stress or the lack of precipitation, we would then anticipate ano yung magiging shortage natin or water shortage. Next slide. We also have geophysical hazard. So medyo these are interchangeable with geological hazards. So any movement of the earth. But we have to delineate na kapag movement ng earth, it's mainly due to the movement of the tectonic plates, either caused by seismic activity or caused by basta anything that doesn't involve water. That's why we have here mass movement na dry, avalanche na dry, rockfall na dry, sudden subsidence na dry. So for example, we have here earthquake. So para lang malinaw yung definition natin, so the existence of the earthquake pertains to the hazard, but the hazard is quantified either in terms of magnitude. So we have here the Richter scale. So the Richter scale details how much energy does the earthquake has released towards its surroundings. So in terms of joules siya. Hindi siya directly nagtatranslate to the ground motion agad. Kasi it also depends how deep was the source of the earthquake was or how loose are the soil within the surroundings pertains to. So yun yung what I mentioned pertains to the hazard exposure component that I presented earlier. So next slide. Eventually, if we wanted to localize the hazard, for example, over a specific area, we have here the last year's Abra last year's Abra earthquake. So we often quantify the local hazard in terms of intensity. So we often heard intensity 8, intensity 7, intensity 5. So that's how we are basically the Mercalli scale, that the one that details the intensity, that details the perception, human perception to the ground motion and the anticipated damage. So as to the exposure, we also have the susceptible populations. Of course, people will be affected by the ground motion. The buildings will also be affected by the ground motion, and the land masses will also be affected by the ground motion. And as to the vulnerability, we quantify that in terms of the increased tendency for landslides, building damage, and the affected population. So landslides right there is another form of disaster. So per definition, that is to be called as associated disaster. So parang there's a primary source, may hazard that caused the main disaster. Then eventually it nagkaroon ng offspring. Parang there's an epidemiology of disasters nga, na there's a resulting disaster from that disaster. So we are also considering that. Next slide. We also have ayan nga, yung building damage nga, yung isa sa components ng vulnerability. Next slide. We also have what's called hydrological hazard, since as the name suggests, hydro or water. So medyo may pagka-wet na component siya. So kanina, yung mass movement, yung avalanche, landslide, or rockfall. So these are disasters caused by events leading to that are caused rather by instability caused by water saturation. Ibig sabihin, kapag basang-basa na yung soil, nawawala na yung capacity niya to handle its own weight. Therefore, disasters could happen in the form of these types of natural hazards. Or, syempre, included din pala, floods, different types of floods. We have coastal floods, flash floods, riverine floods, ice jam floods, and included also are wave actions, rogue waves, or siege. One example here is one of the undergraduate research identifying the risk of flooding in Lopez, Quezon by Pandanan River. So what the student, what Mr. Villafuerte has done in his master's thesis is basically to identify how does, for example, rainfall translates to volume of flow dun sa Lopez River and even yung overflow. By knowing the volume of surface runoff, ma-anticipate niya gaano kataas yung flood na hazard na na-experience ng Lopez, Quezon with a given precipitation event, which was shown on the right picture there. Next slide. We also have meteorological hazard, pero sawang-sawa na tayo dito because na-mention ko na yung typhoons in the introduction nga ng quantification ng hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. But other types of meteorological hazards include extreme temperatures. We also have cold waves. We also have heat waves. We also have fog, local storms, downdrafts or derecho, hails, lightning or thunderstorm, tornadoes, storm surge, tropical cyclones, or any other types of severe weather. And I think parang kung i-compare mo the difference pala between climatological and meteorological, if you mention meteorological, it's over a short duration of time. It's not over longer periods of time. Or the scale of the hazard is often small compared to climatological hazard. So if you mention climatological hazard, ano ba yung scale? Worldwide, global. As to the meteorological hazard, for example, Philippines, or for example, to be specific, Northern Luzon kapag habagat season. So that's how we quantify, that's how we differentiate climatological with meteorological hazard. Next slide. We also have what's called technological hazard. So included in the technological hazards are chemical spills, collapse of the building, so another form of associated disaster kapag may earthquake, explosion, fire, gas spill, poisoning, radiation, and we also have transport accidents, so either air, so pag may plane crash, water, kapag lumubog yung barko or nagkaroon ng maritime disaster, rails, or road na accidents. So what is shown here is the fire audit conducted by Dr. Harold Aquino in his MS thesis. So there are two types of risks in his study. So we have here risk to buildings. We also have he identified 5 risks to buildings. So the buildings itself, yung ina-identify niya na risk. On the other hand, there's also 5 risk to life. So sa mga occupants within. But we mentioned first yung sa buildings. So sa buildings, hazard pertains to the chances na magkakaroon ng sunog. So for example, if there's poor yung electrical assembly, so chances are pwedeng may mag-ignite doon. And if we mention exposure, how many flammable materials are present that are subjected to the fire. Then vulnerability, how flammable are these materials? combining those three, we have here the fire risk for buildings. So in his thesis, he evaluated 15 the fire risk over 15 different buildings, and some of them, unfortunately, natuluyan nga. For example, Faculty Center, which is identified to have the highest fire risk right there, which is around 3.13. So, and as a result of this fire audit, kaya napansin nyo na si main library ngayon, si Gonzales Hall, under renovation kasi nga inaayos yung nire-retrofit siya to address yung hazard. Next slide. So if we mention naman yung sa life, so ano lang, iba na yung definition ng hazard, iba na yung definition ng exposure, iba na yung definition ng vulnerability. Pag sinabi mong hazard, the existence of the fire itself is the hazard. If we mention exposure, how long are people exposed to fire? Or gaano ba sila, for example, yung usok na dala ng fire, gaano sila katagal na expose? And vulnerability, syempre yung mobility, ano ba yung magiging mobility ng tao? Paano ba maapektuhan yung evacuation plan niya? Ano ba yung risk sa life ng tao? Ano yung makakos na physical damage sa tao ng fire? So those three pertains to the risk, fire risk to life. So among the listed buildings, ang mga number one are dormitories because sila yung may maraming occupants. Next slide. And eventually, all of these types of disasters are compiled in MDAT, the one that UNDR report has referred to. And among the pinipitch ko lang din since I'm the National Project Coordinator for MDAT, we've been currently compiling a national disaster database here in the Philippines. And involved in the quantification of the disaster database, next slide, is that missing component na hindi ko na mention. So we mention hazard, we mention exposure, we mention vulnerability. But we also have to quantify. So this is a work in progress. We also have to quantify the capacity. So either in institutional or infrastructural, which I think Doc G has already covered in his previous presentation. And I think with that, I hope na next slide na yung prevention, since we're mentioning response, prevention is better than cure. So we better anticipate for this hazard and prepare ourselves to it rather than to feel sorry at the end. And with that, I end my presentation.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, Sir Joshua. Sir G, we'd like to invite you again. So at this point in our program, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So any students who would like to ask anything from our two presenters for today? Few minutes lang. Sino pong gusto magtanong? Any volunteers? Huwag po kayo matakot. Or magtatawag ba ako? I mean, nagtataas yata ng kamay. May natutunan naman ba tayo about DRRM? I hope may no? Guys, tanong tayo. Baka magpa-quiz bigla si Sir G sa atin.
Ako magtatanong, sinong nakatira sa kondo ngayon dyan? Mga nagko-kondo?
Ayan,
Wala.
kondo daw. Baka may tip sa inyo si Sir G.
Kasi uso sa mga estudyante ngayon nagre-rent ng space sa mga kondo. Wala nagko-kondo dito.
Na kayo may...
Ayun, may nagtataas sa kamay.
Ayan.
Anong floor ka sa kondo? Asang kondo to?
7th floor daw
Saan
siya.
kondo?
Katipunan. Katipunan daw.
Anong kondo doon? Maraming kondo doon eh. FDR. FDR.
FDR.
Bago yun. Ito yung Saan location niya? Tapat ng Ateneo, tapat ng Miriam, tapat ng Town Center. Nasa 7th floor ka, no? Oh, sige. Anyway, FDR. Saan banda to? Across Ateneo. Okay. Across Gate 2. Ilan taon na yung condo niya? Parang, okay. So, it's at least 15 years old na yata, no? Yung condo na yan.
Since 1998 po yata.
Oh, more than 15 years. 1992. So, 31 years old na yan. Okay. Kamusta yung safety features niya? May napapansin ka ba?
As far as I know naman po, safe naman yung building kasi parang yung structure ng building, it's meant for 15 more floors. Pero I think 8 floors pa lang yata yung building na yun.
It's meant for 15 floors? So,
Opo.
sino nagsabi sa iyo niyan?
Yung owner po.
Yung owner. Ba't hindi na sila nagdadagdag ng floor?
I'm not sure po.
Okay. How about emergency systems? Visible ba yung mga firefighting systems nila, fire suppression systems nila?
Yes po.
Mga
Visible naman.
access, mga one?
Yes po.
Kasi that's one thing, no? That's why tinatanong lalo yung condo. Kasi yan, very high ang risk dyan kasi maraming ang occupants nyon. And if it's a 31-year-old building, o nga pala, kapag old construction code, the effective life of a building is 50 years old. And that is the old construction code. That's why tinatanong ko yung mga condo kasi nowadays ang bilis magtayo ng condo. And this I've heard from people in the industry, in the real estate industry, na ang projected life ngayon ng mga bagong building ay 20 years. 20 years. So ibig sabihin yan, after 20 years, you will expect the defects to come out kung hindi i-demolish yan, magtatayo ng bago. The reason why they shorten the life is kasi maraming prefab ngayon and it is to keep the construction industry moving. Kasi kung masyado matibay yung buildings, mababawasan ang construction activity. So imbis na papatibay ng buildings, medyo iiksi nila yung buhay para mabilis ma-demolish at tatayo ng bagong building. Remember, pag condo kayo, you do not own the unit. You own the right. But the building owners themselves can tell the condo occupants anytime, gigibain na to. So wala kayong magagawa. Anyway, I'm asking that because yun nga, high risk nga yung mga ganon. Especially in this area. I don't know, nasan ba ang ating, yung, tawag dyan, yung Marikina Fault. Saan tumatama yan? Alam ko, sasakop yata Katipunan, di ba? Batasan. Okay. So yan, take note, no? I'm stating that, okay, might not be hindi lang condo ang concern dito, but other things, when you look around you, as not just engineers, but as people are now medyo may awareness na about the disaster risk reduction, I think it's high time that the awareness is there. You start identifying the risk. Yeah, medyo heightened praning level. Pero better safe than sorry. Sabi nga ni Prof. Josh sa kanyang last slide. Ano yun? Prevention is better than cure. So, it would be a good idea to already start observing your surroundings, observing yung mga saan kayo nakatira, saan kayo pupunta. Because kapag tinamaan kayo ng disaster week, iba yung malas sa something preventable. Alright? Binanggit ni technological risks kanina, traffic. Pag nasagasaan isang tao, hindi malas yun. Kasi hindi siya dapat tatawid kung saan dumadaan yung mga sasakyan na illegal, di ba? Kumbaga, there are things that can be avoided. Pero pag hindi iniiwasan, hindi na malas yun. Something else. Malas is, andito tayo lahat, biglang may asteroid na tumama sa Earth, yun, malas talaga. Wala tayong magagawa. Tama? But preventable is another thing. We cannot attribute that to malas.
We have a question from the Zoom.
Sige.
Right now, buzzword po ang the big one. What are the measures that our national and local governments are doing to prepare for this? What can students and normal citizens do?
For the big one, tama?
Big one daw, big
Oo,
one.
big one.
Sure. Ano bang big one to?
Oo nga eh. Movie ba yun?
Ano,
Hindi.
Ateneo ba to?
Hindi, I mean, for the big one, I think it's best to to look upon probabilistic
Ano mo na yung big one ba?
Lindol.
Okay, Lindol. Ayan. Dahil baka kasing iba yung sabing big one.
Champion ba sa UAP?
Oo. Okay, so big one, we're talking about the large earthquake that we're expecting. Okay.
Yes. One of the na mga nagawa ng research pertaining disaster risk is yung tinatawag na probabilistic hazard maps. So you can look up these probabilistic hazard maps on Hazard Hunter. So Hazard Hunter, lagay nyo lang yung coordinates ng place nyo. Then the Hazard Hunter will inform you what is the expected na lakas ng hangin na possible na tumama. For example, within 100 years, gaano kalakas yung yung possibility ng ground motion na pwedeng maranasan ng building mo within, for example, a certain return period, ano yung i-expect mo within 25 years, and so on. So that's how you will enable yourselves to prepare. Siyempre, kailangan alam mo yung ina-anticipate mo na risk.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. Do you want to add anything, Sir G? Okay. Yes, sir. Okay.
Hello. So sorry, medyo unrelated sa previous question. Pero during natural calamities, natural disasters, hazards, no, whenever there's like an evacuation, yung ginagamit na facilities are public schools. So gusto ko lang tanungin, why can't the Philippines provide actual disaster relief facilities? Is it a problem of budget, geography, or is it a problem of whether there's any actual locations where they could build or establish facilities for these disasters?
Okay, sige. There are factors to be considered why schools are currently considered as evacuation centers. First is they have the higher importance factor. So in designing these schools, typically mag-assign, for example, ng importance factor greater than 1. That would mean that the building performance against natural hazards are better. Second is the site selection of these schools in general. So in planning, in the planning stage, when pinaplano kung saan ilalagay yung school, typically sila yung nilalagay sa evacuation. Parang sila yung nilalagay yung school on areas that are free or away from potential hazards. So malayo sa ilog, hindi nasa medyo upland siya pero hindi nasa tuktok ng matarik na burol, tapos and so on. Third is yung logistics. Kasi if may dumating na hazard, for example, bagyo, what would happen is suspended yung activities. So hindi din nagagamit yung school. So for practical reasons din kung bakit siya yung ginagamit as evacuation center. Pero tama ka nga that there should be a call to have a separate na evacuation center, pero we would admit na konti yung resources kasi na-allocate on that as of the moment.
Sige. Second question po. Last year kasi there was like this typhoon near Mindanao or in Mindanao po. And President Marcos Jr. said that he would establish a separate department for disaster risk and reduction. Kaso I don't think there's any plans to actually see that proposal through. Is there I just wanted to ask for your thoughts about that department, that potential department.
To be frank, quite frustrating ang current bureaucracy concerning disaster risk. So supposedly it's under the office of the president under the OC. It should be that way because that way madali mong ma-foster yung cooperation between interagencies. Kapag nagkaroon ka ng separate na agency kasi, kailangan parang mag-a-assign pa ngayon ng technical working groups from the other agencies ngayon na i-commit towards that. As of now, mukhang okay naman yung setup ng kailangan lang i-streamline yung process mismo.
Sige po, thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? From our online audience, meron ba ito? Wala naman. Guys, ready na ba kayong bumalik sa school? Or nasa bakasyon pa ang mga isip natin? Nagre-restart pa lang siguro, no? Okay, but I hope you learned a lot from our two speakers for today. I guess we'll be ending our session for today. Thank you for coming. Ayan po, tapos na po tayo. Maraming salamat po. Si Ate Yoli. Ate